next Saturday night, we're sending you back to the future.
If you're a movie fan, then chances are you've seen Marty McFly drive the DeLorean back to the future more than once. Back to the Future follows Michael J. Fox as Marty McFly when he travels back in time to 1955 and accidentally interrupts his parents' first encounter with each other. Marty has just 1 week to get his parents back together before traveling back to the future with the help of Doc Brown, the town clock, and the famous DeLorean hitting 88 miles per hour. This 80s classic was so iconic that for many of us, Doc is still the image we conjure up when we think of the mad inventor.
Sometimes science is more art than science, Morty. A lot of people don't get that.
And with Huey Lewis and the News' hits The Power of Love and Back in Time providing the soundtrack, it is no surprise that the movie became an immediate box office hit when it opened in the summer of 1985.
I'm afraid you're just too darn loud.
The movie is just as well known around the world, though. And in fact, it's such a hit with UK audiences that there is currently a musical adaptation of the movie playing in London's West End. Back to the Future is such a major part of the American zeitgeist that for many kids of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, it's one of the best ways we can learn about life in the land across the sea. The good old US of A. So, join us as we learn what Back to the Future teaches us about America, from an outsider's perspective. This video essay was written by Tongal creator Ross MacKay. He's a Brit, which makes him our titular outsider. When Back to the Future was made, it was such a hit, so popular, so embedded into the fabric of society that even President Ronald Reagan quoted it in his State of the Union address.
As they said in the film, Back to the Future, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Ironically enough, however, a few new roads, especially in the 80s, wouldn't have hurt America's infrastructure. With its depiction of small-time America in two different time periods, overseas audiences can learn a lot about many aspects of American culture. And perhaps the biggest lesson you can learn from the time-traveling flick is about one of the deepest-held ideals, the American dream. The American dream is the concept that is rooted in the premise within the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Or something like that. The idea is that the United States of America is a country where there's opportunity for you to succeed based on your ability and achievements. In Back to the Future, the American dream, or at least the one associated with the contemporary culture of the 1980s, is seen played out when you contrast Marty McFly's family at the beginning of the film with how they appear at the end. For starters, let's take a look at George McFly. At the beginning of the film, George was what most people would consider a wet blanket. He's sheepish, squeamish, and full of doubt. Writer George Gipe, in his novelization of the film, describes him like this. George McFly was 47 but seemed much older to Marty, an uninspired man who was generally afraid to take even the tiniest daring step, not having changed his haircut in over 30 years. He was dressed in an equally boring suit he had purchased 4 years before at Sears. George was not the ideal, quote, American man.
He's a peeping Tom.
He was the opposite. His physical appearance in his youth was lanky, angular, basically non-athletic. He was probably bullied from a very early age, and not just by local idiot Biff, but by other classmates like Mark Dixon, and probably even by some adults, like Stanford Strickland. Marty, on the other hand, was the self-assured, confident American teen that only the 1980s could bring. He doesn't need anyone's approval. He didn't see himself as cool, he didn't see himself as uncool. But let's be clear, Marty McFly is very cool. So when this 1980s American attitude goes back in time decades before to meet his father at the start, he can't help but rub off on him, even if it means his own non-existence. Marty's confidence teaches George confidence. It teaches George to stand up for himself. This confidence is not an attribute George has at the start of the film. But by gaining this confidence back in the 1950s, George uses it throughout his life, leading him to a successful career and more fulfilling family life. In the film, confidence clearly equals success.
Like I've always told you, you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
However, this isn't all Back to the Future has to say about the seminal American belief. Doc Brown's fortunes seem to show that for many, the American dream is simply not achievable. At the start of the movie, newspaper clippings show us that Doc came from a wealthy family, and over the years he's gone bankrupt. There's no question that he's definitely a genius. He invents time travel, okay? But even with such intellectual prowess, Doc just can't seem to catch a break. In fact, Doc even has to steal the plutonium he needs to create the time machine, And, well, that doesn't really work out too great for him in the end, does it? There's no doubt that if Doc didn't come from a wealthy family, he would not have had the resources and the time to create the flux capacitor. And he certainly wouldn't have had the cash to put it into a DeLorean.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
What Back to the Future really tells us is that an aspect of the American dream is as much about your family's past as it is about its future. And that isn't all it teaches us about American history. I mean, apart from the obvious, where we learn things like the 1950s had some really happening milkshake bars. We also learn that the history of the good old US of A is short. Like, super short. Now, of course, the land itself is ancient and people have occupied the Americas for thousands of years, but Robert Zemeckis' film shows us that the United States itself, as an entity, is still a fairly new country. I mean, think about it. If you have a time machine, how far back would you go? The 1950s was not that long ago. The writer of this video essay is from Scotland, and he's currently writing in a house built in the 1800s. He's less than a kilometer from a castle built in the 1200s, just for some perspective. Meanwhile, in Back to the Future, locals are campaigning to stop the authorities fixing a broken clock that has been broken for 30 years, saying it's a part of the town's history. If something was fixed after 30 years in Scotland, that would be seen as a pretty quick repair. That isn't to say that American history isn't interesting. It just means a lot has been packed into a relatively short space of time. You just have to look at how Back to the Future uses 80s technology in the 50s to see how different the world looks over the span of 30 years. When Marty convinces his dad that he is a visitor from outer space using a portable cassette player, the joke only works because such a technology seems so advanced to a teenager from the 50s. But now, looking back on a movie that was made over 35 years ago, shows you how far we have come ourselves. Okay, we might not be living in the future that Back to the Future 2 imagined, but in some respects, we are even more advanced than that. I mean, no one is sending fax machines to fire their employees. That being said, there are some clear parallels between the 1950s and the 80s. That's what makes the film so appealing, as Marty grows to understand how alike he is with his parents when they were teenagers.
Marty, you're beginning to sound just like my mother.
And the USA knows how to do their teenage years well. The milkshake bar as a hangout seems like a great place to have some fun, no matter what time period you're in. And no one does school dances like America, it seems. The band that has been booked for the Enchantment Under the Sea dance is pretty epic sounding, with a full range of instruments and the ability to improvise on the spot, which I suppose must run in the family if you're Chuck Berry's cousin.
You know that new sound you're looking for? Well, listen to this!
And apart from Marty and his trusty skateboard, all these teenagers even in the 50s seem to have access to cars. Pretty swish-looking vehicles too. At least they look good when they're not covered in... With movies like The Breakfast Club, St. Elmo's Fire, and Weird Science also being released in 1985, it seems like this was a golden age to become a teenager in the United States. And the 50s weren't too bad either, unless you're female, of course. Because this film shows Biff force himself upon Marty's mom, Lorraine, not once, but twice, lest we forget. Oh, and Lorraine is also forced to dance with a handsy ginger before George saves the day. Yeah. So in the course of 1 week, Lorraine is harassed on at least 3 separate occasions, with one of those cases definitely the grounds for criminal action. But Biff only ever gets a punch on the nose. Even in the alternate future, he is seen polishing George's car. Poor Lorraine. It's traumatic having to come face to face with a predatory Biff on her own driveway. And while there might be a whole bunch of other movies you would put ahead of the time-traveling flick for a hard-hitting social commentary on American society, it still has a lot to say about some of the most contentious issues in American history. It is set in the pre-civil rights movement 1950s after all. And Back to the Future doesn't shy away from this either. Okay, it's only touched upon lightly, but it's still there. At the start of the film, we see that Hill Valley has mayor elections coming up and Goldie Wilson is running for re-election. But back in 1955, Goldie is only a busboy. When Marty gives him the idea of running for mayor, the owner of the cafe scoffs at the idea of a black man becoming mayor. But this isn't the only spot of racial tension we see in the movie. When the white bullies are confronted by the black bandmates outside the Enchantment Under the Sea dance, racial slurs are heard within the script, hinting at just how deep tensions may have run in 1950s America. But that isn't to say that the film was made in a time of complete racial equality. If the movie was remade today, would it still leave in the gag about Marty McFly coming up with Johnny Be Good? After all, it is another example of a white person being credited for creating an aspect of black culture that has been adopted by the mainstream. And we don't have a DeLorean to look into the future to see if other aspects of the film age poorly over time. Although, that would be pretty awesome.
Bear with me, Marty. All your questions will be answered. Roll tape.
But whether they do or they don't, one thing is for certain. Back to the Future captured many of our childhood hearts. We dreamed of jumping in that car with Doc Brown for a wild adventure. Back to the Future may be the reason so many of us put a board and 4 wheels under our feet in a bid to look even half as cool as Michael J. Fox. Back to the Future is a movie that captures the sense of possibility you feel as a teenager, with the whole world and its future stretched out in front of you.
Yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
And that may be why the film continues to find fans in America and beyond. Will it remain as popular in the future? Who knows? But there's only one way to find out.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.